So following from last video where I went to a undergraduate conference and presented my work in fractional calculus, and this video is about doing research on your own, and more specifically we're looking at something called a literature review. So basically a literature review is to summarize key ideas and what has been done in a particular field that you're researching, and also some of the open problems that are currently being researched and some of the problems that you have come up with or come across when you're researching this particular field that you're interested in. Often you might need a literature review in, for example, a thesis or a dissertation, and it could also be in some sort of research proposal when you're asking for funding. And when you're asking for funding, people need to know what you're researching basically, and this literature review basically presents people with a basic idea and a background information about what you want to research. But apart from being a part of a thesis or being a part of a research proposal, it could also be a standalone piece submitted to a journal. And once in a while, it's actually good to have some sort of literature review, and people new to the field could have some sort of a document that summarizes everything that has been done thus far. So to actually do the literature review, obviously you have to choose a field, and it could be something broad. For example, what I did at first was just I wanted to look at something called fractional calculus, and I just searched it up in Google Scholar, and over time you start to notice that you sort of gravitate towards something that you find interesting. And for me personally, in fractional calculus, I sort of went into the direction of application of it in physics and in quantum mechanics, and that's actually what I did for my presentation in the last video. So what you want to do is just start consuming a lot of content. By content I mean a lot of papers and books about the topics that you are interested with, and over time you find that you're going from a really broad idea and start focusing into a more particular topics. Something that I find to be really useful is something called LitMap. Now this video is not sponsored by LitMap, but personally I find it to be very useful because it sort of gives you a visualization of how one paper links to the other, and from that you can also try to find the next paper to read. And to find papers to read, there are 3 websites that I think are really useful. The first one is Google Scholar, which is really good for looking up different papers, and they also have a citing tools where you could copy in the bib tags for your LaTex documents, or they even have like built-in citation for a particular style. For example, you might use it for Vancouver or APA, etc. And the other 2 are ResearchGate and Arxiv. So one thing that I think you should really do when you're reading the literature is make notes, and this is really useful for you later on when you want to refer back and take out the key ideas from each paper. It is also really important that you keep track of your references. It's really a pain to trace back all the references once you have done the literature review. It's because it's really hard to track precisely where each information comes from which paper, and so I suggest when you are reading the literature, make notes but also keep track of the references. Some tools that you might use is, for example, JabRef or RefWorks. I've heard nice things about either program. Personally I use JabRef, but that's just my personal preference, but you can try to find what works best for you. But it's really important to give the citation, because not only is making your work more authentic and honest about where your information comes from, it's also really useful for others trying to get into the field, because people can just click on your references and go to other papers, and I think that's a really good thing to have when you're doing research, because one thing that you really want is consume a lot, and by a lot I mean a lot of literature and content about the topic. And over time you have to try to niche down and go into more specific problems and repeat the process of reading paper, making notes, tracking references, and niching down and repeating the process. And over time you realize that you start to get a understanding of what you're researching, and at that point you can consider writing it up. And typically I think a good structure is as follows. So to start with, you have a abstract section at the top of your paper, which is about giving people a quick glimpse into what your paper is about and some of the key results that you have found. And in the introduction section you may talk about some of the background information or the historic motivation regarding that field, and also some of the prerequisites that people might need in order to understand the later part of the literature review basically. And then over the paper, I would say try to summarize some of the key ideas and key results. I wouldn't say there's a particular structure that I would suggest. It depends on the nature of what you're researching, and between the introduction section and the end, I think there's some sort of creative freedom up to the author, depending on the type of stuff you want to write. And towards the end, I would suggest writing a conclusion and just summarizing some of the most important results over the paper that you have discussed. And it's also really important, and this is, I would argue, being one of the most important point of doing literature review, is giving people a direction of further research. And so at the end, ideally you want to talk about some of the open problems and current research in the fields that you're researching. Now, doing a literature review is a really difficult task, obviously. It takes a lot of practice, and there's really no good way other than just keep on repeating this process and keep writing and diving into more of the literature. However, I think something that might be useful to you is actually looking up others' literature review, and over time you get sort of a feel about what you want to include and what the typical format is, and that's always really useful when it comes to doing research, and not just literature review in particular. Actually, you start to get a sense of the typical standard and format and how people phrase stuff, and that's part of the research process and becoming a better researcher. So I hope this video is useful, and in the future I think I would also share some of the tools that I find to be really useful when it comes to doing research. In this video I've already talked about a few, but hopefully in a future video I will talk into more depth about more tools, and so hopefully that will be interesting. And so I guess I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.